There are some truly spectacular spells in Warhammer 3, but which ones can deal the most damage? Today we're going to count down the top 10 best damage spells in Total War Warhammer 3. And no, we're not counting unique spells like Lord Crow or the Cataclysm spells. First up we have a couple of honourable mentions, the Foot of Gork. Now yeah, I know it does a lot of damage, and if you get it on a big clump you can easily take out as many units as you can get into the very large area of effect. It only missed out on the list since it's the worst of a bunch of similar spells, and the main problem is friendly fire. The radius is so large and the damage so high that you are guaranteed to take out a ton of your own troops unless the enemy somehow manages to make a giant tactical blob formation. In ideal situations, it's a great spell, but those conditions are just far too hard to come across to get value reliably. And secondly, the Wind of Death. It's just not quite as good as the other options. There's plenty of wind spells on this list, and the others that made it are just better, whether it's raw damage, cost, or a mixture of both. I love my vampire boys, but this just isn't good enough to make it. It's not quite top 10, but it's definitely not far behind. Coming to the actual list now, in 10th place we have the Flames of Asgore. Now yeah, there is an argument to be made that this is just as bad as the Foot of Gork, for basically the same reasons, and there is some truth in that. Unless you get a clump of enemies the size of Birmingham, you're going to struggle to avoid friendly fire, because the radius is just so large and the damage is just so high. But I'm still choosing to put this one on the list and just above the Foot of Gork for a couple of reasons. First of all, the damage is outstanding and eclipses that of the Foot of Gork. The armor piercing ratio is much higher, missiles and missile explosions, so it deals a crapload of damage over a longer period of time whilst causing absolute chaos in its radius from all the disruption. Now yes, the risk to your own troops is still pretty damn high, possibly even more so since basically anything inside of a large radius is going to get turned to dust. On the flip side, anything inside the radius is going to get turned to dust, so as long as you target on enemies, you're going to pick up a ton of kills. Like I said, these spells are really close in terms of power. It just feels like this one is the most devastating, so I had to choose it for the list. Add on the fact that Overcast makes even more of the devastating missiles, and it's an easy pick. The Big Foot only gets more armor piercing damage, something the Flames have no problem with right out the gate. Yes, this Overcast is one of the most expensive spells in the game, but if it's targeted right, you can easily get your value. In 9th place we have the Comet of Cassandra. This is of course a bombardment spell, and it deals some pretty devastating damage in its target area. The armor piercing ratio is pretty great and the area is decent, so you can rack up a ton of damage if you hit it right. The thing that really makes this outstanding, however, is the fact you can cast it on walls. Now yes, most bombardment spells can be cast on walls, but in the case of others such as Searing Doom or Bolts of Burning, there are multiple projectiles, so the damage is spread over an area, which can sometimes be a good thing, but the walls are not a large area. In fact, they're about as large as the Comet's radius, so if you can keep enemies on the walls and get off a cast, you can hit a massive number of entities condensed into a small area. And as I said, the damage is pretty top tier. Outside of the walls, the spell is also reasonably strong. Of course, entities won't be as clumped up as they are on walls, so the damage won't be quite as good, but if you can find a nice clump, you can still deal some great damage and get a ton of value for a relatively low price compared to some other higher tier spells. The Overcast doubles the explosion damage, and it's still all armor piercing. It just makes it even easier to put this one on the list. That much AP on a big clump of enemies will make almost anything break, or damn close to it. In 7th place we have Plague. Looking at just the spell card for this one, it seems like it's utterly useless. 8 damage per second for 20 seconds? That's only 160 damage even if it is all armor piercing. But of course, the secret lies in where you target it. If it's on a single entity, then yeah, that's not going to be a lot of damage. But if you get it onto a clump of enemy entities, that's going to be 160 damage per entity, and if you're looking at infantry, that can be a lot of entities. The radius isn't massive, but it's still enough to completely cover a unit or two depending on their formation, meaning you can easily be hitting a couple hundred entities at once depending on your unit size. Now yes, this can also hit your own units, but it's also a scathing spell, so who really cares? The only downside of this spell is that its damage is over time, so enemies can walk out of it to avoid damage, and if they retreat, your units will likely follow them deep into the spell, making for some friendly fire that even the Skaven might start to take issue with. The Overcast gets you a nice 50% damage buff, so nothing to complain about there. Just get it on a clump of enemies and try to keep an eye on your own troops walking into the spell, and you should get plenty of value. Next up we have the Pit of Shades. Honestly, this is pretty similar to Plague with some very slight but very significant differences. The damage and duration are lower, but the area is higher. So why is it higher in my ranking? Well, it also has the added effect that it sucks units towards the center of the spell, making it basically impossible to escape for most lower mass troops. You're still getting pretty great damage since it's all armor piercing on every entity in the effect, and now you're pulling in as many troops as you can throw at it to rack up even more value. If enemy units continue moving into the radius, they'll keep getting sucked up, meaning theoretically you can get a massive number of entities in one cast, and knowing how good the pattern is in these games, you for sure will. Add on the fact that post-spell the disruption will make it easy for your front lines to get up close and personal, and it's a great spell that I always pick up if I can. Of course, there's still the risk of hitting your own troops, and they're just as easily sucked into the effect, which is why it's not going any higher, but it's still a top tier spell if you can get a good block to target. The Overcast increases the damage by 60%, so nothing to complain about there. it'll still slap even harder, so what's not to love? Coming in 6th place, we have Van Geist's Revenge. Moving into the wind spell, and you may notice that spells of a similar type have been grouped a little bit in this list, and that's for good reason. The stationary vortex spells are super strong, but they're also expensive and have a high risk of friendly fire, so I don't really feel like I can justify them going much higher. Wind spells you have much more control over and can make sure more of the damage is going on to enemies and not your own troops. They're also normally much cheaper whilst getting tons of value, so get a little bit of boost in ranking too. With all that said, we have Van Geist's Revenge. Yes, it's not even slightly cheap, hence why it's the first wind spell to show up. What it is, however, is devastating. The damage here is massive, armor piercing, and once the fairly long and spectacular looking windup is complete, the damage comes out more or less in a single literal barrage, meaning if enemies don't get out of the way during the windup, there's no way they're avoiding the torrent of damage headed their way. The area is nice and large, meaning you can easily get a couple of units in a single cast, and of course, that wind shape makes it easy to minimize friendly fire. The overcast gets you a nice 50% damage boost, so lots to love there. Now yes, the cost is truly massive, but the damage value you can get here will be equally massive. As long as the enemy has a few high value units in a line, you can't go wrong dropping this into any battle. And it's not going any higher, pretty much due to the insane cost. It's well worth it, but compared to other spells, the wins to value ratio isn't quite as great. Breaking into the top 5, we have Penumbral Pendulum. I think we all know that I had to put this one here, and yes, it's not as overpowered as it once was, but it's still a pretty great spell. It's a little costly, but the damage is damn good, even with only 50% armor piercing. The speed that damage comes out is nice and fast, and the area it covers is plenty large to get you a couple of frontlines troops in a single cast. The overcast increases the damage and armor piercing ratio, making it even more devastating, with a massive amount of damage coming in the exact same package as before. Honestly, there's not much to complain about. There's no real windup, so it's nearly impossible to dodge, the damage is great, and it disrupts formations, making your front lines have a much easier time cleaning up afterwards. It's not any higher, pretty much down to the cost, with both forms being fairly expensive. They're worth the price, don't get me wrong, but there are just better values elsewhere. Coming in 4th place, we have Blossom Wind. If you're looking for value, then this is the spell for you. It's a relatively fast-moving wind spell with a fairly short wind-up. The damage it deals is all armor piercing and can shred through infantry pretty nicely. It's not going to one-shot anything later in the game, but the full armor piercing will keep it relevant. Plus, it's under 10 winds of magic baseline, which is pretty damn cheap. Top it off with the blinded contact effect, meaning any units hit will suffer massive penalties, and you've got a pretty great spell for a very reasonable price. The nearly 50% damage increase from the overcast while still being a mid-cost cements its position in the top 5. Later in the game, the overcast will do great work to thin out enemy front lines, all without breaking the Winds of Magic bank. In 3rd place, we have Hellhammer, another of the Chaos Dwarf spells breaking into this list, and this one is pretty damn top tier. It's another extremely expensive spell, but honestly the value here is just so worth it. I just had to place it this high. After a fairly long windup, the damage dealt comes quickly and devastates anything it comes into contact with. It's high armor piercing, fire and magical damage, so basically anything is going to feel a world of pain upon impact. The overcast says extended duration, which doesn't really make much sense until you realize duration means length of the effect. It doubles, so you can hit a massive area with the exact same devastating damage as before and wipe out 2 or 3 entire units if you target it right. Yes, the cost is massive, but just look at the damage you gain. The spell is the epitome of you get what you pay for. It's costly, yes, but that cost will be paid straight back with insane damage you get. Now yes, you do need to target it right, and the long windup leaves plenty of time for dodging, but when it lands just right, there are a few wind spells that do it better. In fact, I can only think of one. Yes, in 2nd place we have Fiery Convocation. Hilariously, we have one of the best spells in the game coming from arguably one of the worst laws. This is another one with a fairly long windup, so if the AI has any sense, they'll easily get out of the way. Lucky for us, we're talking Total War AI, so it'll just sit there waiting to die whilst your spell completes its warm-up animation. When it eventually does land, the damage is insane. High armor piercing, fire and magic in a massive radius and length, and it's fairly quick impact, so no time for last second dodges. The overcast almost doubles this damage, and pretty much nothing can stand up to this if they get hit by the full force. It will wipe entire full health elite troops from the map in a single cast if you can hit them straight. Again, it's a more expensive spell, but it is so worth the cost. The damage potential is insane, and one cast can easily decide the outcome of whatever battle you find yourself in, as long as that battle has a crapload of front lines for you to target. And in 1st place, we have, as a surprise to no one, the Amber Spear. I mean, the range, the damage, the fact it hits a single target, and the fact I'm completely lying, and it is obviously Warp Lightning. It's not a surprise to anyone this spell is number 1. Baseline, with no skills, it's amazing. Massive armor piercing damage in a concentrated explosive area for devastation onto whatever you target. Fast casting time so that damage is hitting pretty damn fast, relatively low cooldown, all for the low cost of 6 Winds of Magic. With various skills and such, you can bring down the cooldown and cost significantly and basically have permanent warp lightning thunderstorms above the battlefield. The Overcast doubles the cost to increase the number of missiles. Honestly, I don't think you even need the Overcast once the base spell has all the reductions on it, since you can easily do as much damage spread across the battle for basically the same cost. Add on the fact you can use any way you want, and it's a no-brainer. Skaven always get the most broken stuff, and this spell is no different. And that's our list. Let me know if you change anything down in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and if you want to know what noob mistakes to avoid in Warhammer 3, then check out this video to see the top 10.